down here and eat
They
some lunch and
serve
let them
bacon
take it
for
away.
lunch?
No bacon for lunch. Yeah.
Oh, thanks. Hello?
Hello? Hello?
You're on. You're on.
I'm on. Hello?
Yeah.
I think you're not allowed to speak maybe today, Lee. I don't know. Does it work?
Yeah, I don't seem to be on. Oh, there we go.
Okay.
So, again, what we're going to be talking about is a deep dive into Starling. Now, the funny story about the name is that we proposed this session title, and I think it was Colin responded and said, "Oh, we need a more catchy title so that people will like it." And then you were joking, right?
So yeah, I was joking like, why not talking about bacon, and then
just add bacon to the name of the thing as a joke, but then it actually turned out to be the name. So we're not going to be talking about bacon. Yeah, I know. Well, maybe we can answer questions about bacon and other streaky meats later. But what we want to talk about is Starling. So really quickly, who we are. My name is Lee BRIMELOW. I'm a developer evangelist at Adobe. I run a tutorial site called gotoandlearn.com. I blog at leebrimlow.com. And you want to introduce yourself?
So I'm Thibault. I'm there. French.
That's French, right?
Sorry. Yeah. And I'm product manager in the at Adobe, working on gaming and looking at the graphics and ActionScript and the VM, and also this new tool we call Monocle.
Yeah. So I had like, the usual cheesy pictures of each of us, like, but then I thought, we could put up the personalities we'd be most associated with on Breaking Bad. This is what I think. People on Twitter are saying it would actually be the opposite. I don't agree with that, but anyway. So when we're talking about Starling, we have to first talk about a technology called Sparrow. So there was an iOS game framework written in Objective-C called Sparrow, and this was written in a way that makes it really easy for Flash developers to build Objective-C games for iOS. And then what happened is, did we approach them, or
so what happened is when we designed Stage 3, very quickly we discovered, hey, it's going to be very hard for people to create 2D games on Stage 3 if they're not GPU developers. So we approached Daniel, who's driving Sparrow, and we said, hey, what if we had like Sparrow's brother that would be essentially for Flash developers on top of Stage 3D?
Yeah. So all the stuff we've been talking about with Stage 3D when we demo, or like, Unreal Tournament and all these crazy 3D things, but the big feedback we got was that, hey, those are not, those are good for certain game developers, but creating really high performant 2D games is actually in more demand than I would say even the 3D stuff. So that's where Starling was born. And it's basically an ActionScript 3 API that allows you to target Stage 3D using an API which is almost identical to the one you're already used to, the Flash display list. So Thibault mentioned the developer of both of these frameworks is Daniel Spurl. So we reached out to him, and it's been a really good working relationship. And Starling has gotten amazing community support as well. So there's a really thriving community helping to move this framework forward. So another important thing just to note is that Adobe is officially supporting Starling, which means we're actually paying for some of the development of Starling moving forward. So it's definitely something that we're officially getting behind and supporting.
Yeah, we're also looking at potential tooling integration, making sure that essentially in the future, like whatever we develop in the future, Starling is going to be part of that and help developers. So lots of cool things happening, like what if we had like components on top of Starling for developers, things like that.
Yeah, because one of the big areas that people really are complaining about now is, sure, Stage 3D is a great technology, and you saw it in the last session, all the cool stuff you can do with it, but people are using Flash Professional, and that doesn't target Stage 3D at all. So there is this gap and this need that we're planning to fill for how do you actually create some nice tooling to allow you to target GPU-based games, because Flash Pro is all about vectors and the regular Flash display list. So for those who haven't played around with Starling, here's just some sample code. I'm assuming everybody here is familiar with regular Flash, display list type code. Well, the Starling API, in as many cases as possible, it directly mimics the regular Flash display list. So you can see that instead of using the flash.display.sprite class, you're just going to use the starling.display.sprite. And using that will automatically make it run on the GPU. But once I've changed that import, the actual code here for creating the sprite, setting its X and Y, adding it to the display list is identical to what you're already used to with Flash. So now Starling does give you a lot of additional features that the Flash display list doesn't, but it's been made to make it really easy to use if you're used to regular Flash display list. So yeah.
So this, if you download the Starling framework today, you're going to find those little folders, and in each folder you have separate classes, separate ActionScript classes, and really Starling is a very small framework. I think compressed this week is around 60, 70K. Maybe it's changed a little bit recently, but it's very small. So you're not adding a huge like dependency. It doesn't have a huge footprint on your application. So even for mobile apps, you should definitely use Starling.
So yeah, so I just want to highlight a couple of areas of the APIs just to show you how similar they are to regular Flash display lists. So here's the display package. You can see you have blend modes, a button object, your display object, movie clip, sprite. We have some additional ones, which is an image, which is kind of similar to the bitmap object in Flash. When we look at the events package, you can see very similar to what you're already used to. We have an enter frame event, we have keyboard events, and Starling was actually built with mobile in mind first, so it's actually has a full touch API as well built into it. And then, classes to make it easy to deal with text, a bitmap font class, which we'll talk about in a little bit, and just the regular text field object, that you're used to. So again, not to harp on this point, but the whole idea behind Starling is, hey, I'm not a GPU geek who can do all of this like OpenGL type programming, but I know Flash, so I want to be able to also tap into the GPU, and that's what this framework is.
Yeah, it's really like we want developers to focus on the game and not necessarily the details and the behind the scenes.
Right. So I want to cover how you go about working with assets in Starling. So obviously when we're talking about GPU-based games, or really games in general nowadays, you're going to be talking about sprite sheets in some form. And obviously Starling has full support for sprite sheets built into it. And for creating these sprite sheets, there's obviously a lot of tools out there. The new version of Flash Professional, which is Flash CS6, actually has a built-in sprite sheet exporter. So you can be doing your timeline animation, like a character animation, just right-click on it in Flash and generate a sprite sheet. And also, there's a great tool I'm sure many of you have used called Texture Packer, which also has support for this built into it. So here's what the sprite sheet generator looks like in Flash CS6. Now, this sprite sheet exporter in the data format is not just limited to Flash. You can also use this for HTML5 games, native mobile games. And you can see for Starling, you're going to want to set this data format pull-down menu to Starling, and then it's going to generate a data file, which is just an XML file that Starling can use.
And talking about integration, like those are the areas where in the future version of Flash Pro, we can actually improve the workflow and add some more features. Yeah. So right now, I'd say the minimal stuff, but we're going to keep improving that.
Yeah. So here's just a quick screenshot of Texture Packer. Now, one thing to note if you're wanting to use Texture Packer, you actually, for a data format, Starling is not in there yet, but Starling just uses the same data format as Sparrow. So you would just choose Sparrow as the data format. So lots of different ways in which you can create and incorporate sprite sheets. Now, on top of the idea of a sprite sheet, generally what a lot of people will do in games is like, okay, I have my little hero character. I'm going to put all of his animations and stuff into a sprite sheet. I have this little alien. I'm going to put all its animations in a sprite sheet. I'll put all my miscellaneous graphics in another sprite sheet. Well, that's something you want to try to avoid. So just because you want to be able to pack as many of the sprites in your game onto a single sprite sheet, and that's where the idea of a texture atlas comes in, where you can easily add sprites from a bunch of different areas of your game, and then easily be able to reference them. Like down here, I have this code, which is my texture atlas.getTextures, and I can give it a name, and it will pull out just those specific textures.
Yeah, and the idea is really to minimize the number of assets you have, minimize the number of upload that you do to the GPU, because uploading on the GPU is most of the time synchronous and very costly on mobile devices.
It's synchronous.
Yeah, so you don't want to do too much of that. And then also another thing is you don't want to have the shader to switch to different textures all the time to sample.
Shader?
Yeah, so if let's imagine the way Starling works behind the scenes is that if you have all your different objects in different sprite sheets, every time you're going to essentially use them or manipulate them is going to keep sampling all those different pixels from those different textures, and doing the state on the GPU is costly. So you don't want to do that. You want to have as many objects on one single texture.
Yep. So we have a new texture format that Adobe has created for Stage 3D called Adobe Texture Format. You want to talk about that?
So it's something we're going to be we'll introduce that on Adobe Labs in a few days. We'll introduce new tools to allow you to create those ATF files. If you look at the documentation right now for Stage 3D, you're going to see this mysterious API called Upload Compressed Texture from Byte, which is, by the way, the longest API we've ever created. Pretty proud. But this API takes a compressed texture. It's essentially a compressed file, which is an ATF file. And just to make it quick, an ATF file is a container for compressed textures on the GPU. And the thing is, on each platform, iOS or Android or desktop, each GPU basically is compatible with different hardware formats, like ETC1 for NVIDIA on Android, or PVRTC for iOS, or DXT for Windows. And you don't want to deal with that complexity, so we're going to introduce the tools where you take a ping, and then that ping is going to be transformed to an ATF file. And that ATF file will be uploaded to the GPU, and automatically Flash Player or Air will extract the appropriate compressed texture depending on the platform. And it is super convenient. And the goal with this is that the texture is decompressed and stored on the GPU memory, whereas if you use a ping, it's going to be stored in CPU memory. So if you want to target an iPad 1 or those devices and you have lots of things, lots of textures, you need to use compressed texture. And it will also make your content run faster, because having them compressed on the GPU make actually the shader access the pixels faster too. So yeah, you definitely need to use that, and we will provide that in a few days on Adobe Labs.
Few days, and this support is built into Starling, right?
And that's a great point. Today already, you can see the comments in Starling. It's already supported in Starling. There's an upload ATF data API, which takes an ATF, and you're good to go.
So one of the things I wanted to highlight is, the current workflow right now is, you're creating your animations, let's say in Flash Pro or somewhere else. Then you're generating a sprite sheet, and then you're including that sprite sheet into your thing. But a lot of people just want to have movie clips that they've created in Flash, and at runtime just load in a Swift with all those animations and have Starling essentially create all of those sprite sheets dynamically at runtime, so you can just work with your vector Swift file or whatever. There's a nice extension to Starling. You can get it at that GitHub URL at the bottom, and I'll be posting these slides as well, called Dynamic Texture Atlas. And this allows you to load in a vector movie clip, and then at runtime, when your game loads, to actually handle all of that kind of creation at runtime.
And the idea behind this, most people do that because they want to be able to use vectors from the Swift and scale the vectors at runtime depending on the resolution of the device, and then generate the sprite sheet at the correct resolution for the device, which is super useful for multi-screen development. So if you're on the Retina stuff, you're going to scale larger and then generate different sprite sheets.
So do you think this might eventually find its way into the framework
Yeah,
itself?
it's probably one of those things that community extensions that may actually land into Starling's mainline.
Cool. So pro tip, well, we already really talked about this, but to pack as many as your graphics possible into texture atlases, because again, you want to minimize the amount of things that have to be uploaded to the GPU. But also, let's say you're building a game for the web, it also minimizes the amount of network operations you have to do. And
State changes and all that,
yeah.
that stuff.
So when we're looking at, the display, we all know the display objects in Flash, movie clips, sprite, text field, like all of those types of things. In Starling, it's very similar. There's some minor differences. So the most low-level display object is a quad, and this is literally just a square, two triangles, which creates a square of color, essentially.
Yep.
So that's like the most low-level display object you can get. An extension of that quad is the image object, and the image object is essentially just the quad, but it allows you to put a texture onto that quad. Yep. And this is similar to like the bitmap class in Flash. This is something you can add to the display list and manipulate it like you would expect. Now we're getting up to the container level. Sprite, again, very similar to regular Flash. I think it's the lowest level container object.
Yep.
And lastly, a movie clip. Now, the movie clip obviously behaves a little bit different than the regular Flash movie clip, but basically you're going to provide a set of textures coming out of, let's say, your texture atlas for the animation for that movie clip. But once you do that, it's similar to working with the movie clip that you're already used to. So there are some other, we'll get to text in a second, but those are your main display objects. So another pro tip, can you believe it?
Yeah. So one of the things we discovered.
Peter Brady over here. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's part of the the work we're doing with Daniel. Like the graphics team at Adobe is really working with Daniel, and when we discover stuff, we let him know. One thing we discovered is that on some hardware, like especially again some like the iPad 1, for instance, and some other Android devices. If you don't use blending in the shaders and behind the scenes in Starling on the GPU, it makes stuff run much faster. So if you don't need transparency, right, just make sure you disable blend mode.
So for like a background image for your game?
Yes, some people have asked, why is it not by default? But then, I mean, most people need transparency.
Well, yeah, because most images you're going to use are going to be like transparent pins.
Yeah,
you're going to need the transparency. But for just a flat background thing where you don't need alpha blending, setting blend mode to none actually will speed up performance a little bit.
Yep.
So working with text, again, the actual text field class, very similar to what you're used to in Flash. There's two ways to provide fonts for the text field class. You can provide an embedded true type font. I think you can also do device fonts, right?
Yeah.
Give it a device font.
Yeah, because essentially Starling falls back, uses text field by default behind the scenes to draw the text and then draw that to bitmap data and upload that to the GPU.
Yeah. But by far the best way to go is to use bitmap fonts. Just in general, you're going to get a lot better performance, especially for text that's going to be changing a lot. So let's say you have like a high score, or you have a timer or something like that. If you were to use like a regular true type font, it would have to change the invisible text field, re-render the bitmap data, upload it to the it'd be a disaster. So definitely bitmap fonts, and there's full support built into Starling for bitmap fonts. So animation in Starling. Now, when I'm talking about animation, what I'm talking about here is like your main game loop or your game timer. So the enter frame event that's actually in Starling behaves more like a real game timer. So here I'm listening for the enter frame event .enter frame, and inside of that I can actually get the elapsed time. So I can say find out the event .pass time, and I can provide that to like any of my game objects. So I can send in that delta and send it to my game objects. So again, the enter frame event here is actually a little more robust and more specific to be like a game timer.
That's true. You don't have to do that own logic yourself. It's fast already. Some more tips. Okay.
Optimization tips. Want to take this one?
Yeah. So one thing we discovered, it's not necessarily related to Starling, but general thing about ActionScript development, and it showed up many times in forums for Starling. If you don't export the release build, and I'm sure you guys have seen that, the performance will be much slower. And the reason for that is when you don't export the release build, we have all those debug details inside the Swift that makes the runtime performance slower. So really always make sure you export as a release build. Also when you package that onto a mobile device, it's like day and night. We had people complaining and say, oh, I don't understand, my game's dropped from 60 frames per second to 12.
So this is always been a problem with Flash, and that if you're looking at the debug version of something, it's obvious, it's going to be a little bit slower. With Starling in particular, it's like dramatic.
Yeah, especially on mobile, you can see that.
But even on the desktop, like for instance, like when you're moving your mouse around on the over the Starling, the frame rate will just be like really bad. So it's important at regular intervals to export a release build to get a real idea of the performance, because it's just a big gap here.
The good news is that we're kind of trying to move away from the debug system right now.
Talking about Monocle,
yeah. Where we're heading is that in the future, you essentially won't be using debug builds, because the profilers, especially a new profiler we're building, actually does not rely on debug builds at all, but release builds. So it's something that's going to go away. So one thing important too, if you want to move things, let's say you have lots of object in a container and you want to move that container around. What's very important is to make sure you flatten the entire set of children contained by this container. And this API flatten, it really makes sense. What happens is, let's say you have a container that contains like clouds and stuff, and you want to move all the clouds. And those clouds inside the container do not have like independent motion in individual transformations. Then just call flatten. It's going to basically render the entire set of objects in one draw call, rather than multiple draw calls to preserve transformation for each individual object. So just make sure you call flatten. What happens is once you call flatten, you can move things, and it's drawn in one draw call. And when you actually call unflatten, you will actually restore the initial behavior, and you can move objects, and then you can call flatten again. So it's a very, very efficient way to move objects.
And this is very similar to cache's bitmap in the regular player, where if you know something's not going to be changing a lot,
it's actually even better than cache's bitmap.
Well, but it's the same
exactly.
concept. So if it's going to be something that's changing a lot, you're going to get worse performance with flatten, right?
Yeah.
Because it's going to have to. You're going to have to keep calling on flatten.
Yes, but at least it doesn't have this kind of invisible or implicit behavior that cache's bitmap had, where you would set cache's bitmap and you would stretch the container, and it would regenerate all those things without telling you. Right. Starling at least will just not do anything.
Right. So a big one, and again, this is similar to what you're used to in Flash, except with a mouse. Like if you have like a container or certain objects that don't need to be interactive with the mouse, you could set mouse enabled to false on those things, and you would get some performance benefit, because it wouldn't have to go through and do all of this event stuff. The same is true in Starling. So Starling, just so you know, Starling doesn't have a mouse API at all. It's all touch based. The API is all touch. So now that will still work with a mouse, obviously, because that's still considered a touch point. But if you have a container or certain objects that don't need to be interacted with either the mouse or the finger, set its touchable property to false, and that's going to really help to speed things up, because it doesn't have to worry anymore about like all these like touch events that it has to test for. Let's say you have a game where you're using the keyboard, like the arrow keys and the space bar to do like a shooter game. You can just set the entire like top level container to touchable equals false, and that will really help.
And that makes sense. Starling doesn't have to check if you're touching or interacting.
It can just skip that whole thing. So you know, I know everybody out here knows what an object pool is and how important it is to use in games, particularly when, you know, when we're talking about mobile. But just in case, the idea is that, you know, let's say I'm building like a Space Invader type game. I'm going to be firing a bunch of bullets all the time, and they're going to be going off screen. And you know, the idea is you want to create enough of those at the very beginning of your game so that you can just reuse them, because the actual garbage collecting and instantiation is pretty expensive in Flash, so you want to avoid that at all costs. So definitely using object pools is going to be really important, but especially when you go to mobile, this is going to be, it's going to absolutely be vital that you use object pooling.
And again, the good news is we're fixing that right now. We're really looking at fixing the GC and improving the GC, but still, you will.
It's still a good idea.
It's still a good idea to do that because, you know, it will help.
Now, Starling doesn't have a built-in object pool class, but there's a lot of them out there already. But feature request, it'd be cool to have one built into Starling.
Yep.
So we'll talk about that. We'll take that offline. I think that's what the business people always, I hear them saying. We'll take that offline. Fabulous. Minimizing state changes. So again, Starling tries to do as many draw calls batched together, so it can reduce the number of draw calls. But anytime you change the state of a Starling display object, it's going to have to, you know, to do another draw call for that. And what do we mean by changing the state? Well, this includes changing the texture. And this, if you're changing the texture that's on a display object and it's not in the same texture atlas, that will cause a state change. Textures from the same atlas will be fine. So let's say you have a sequence of animation frames, that will be fine. Changing the blend mode of display objects, changing the smoothing value of images, the repeat mode of textures, and there's also a tint property to allow you to actually tint display objects. That will also cause a redraw. So you basically want to avoid, you know, as much as possible doing any of these things to your sometimes you're going to have to, but just be aware that this will cause a state change and will force an additional draw call.
Yep. Yeah. So there's also this API that's not, I mean, if you start using Starling tomorrow, you're not going to think about this API because you don't have that API in the Flash runtime today. But there's this low-level API behavior in Starling that powers the core, essentially, of Starling. And you can use it yourself if you really want to have control on the batching. And the QuadBat class does that. It basically batches draw call, and it allows you to draw objects with the least amount of draw calls. So let's say you have a background, or you have something composed of the same images, and you just want to tile them or create a background. Then you're going to be using the QuadBat class because this is all you need. You don't need that to be container. You don't need that to be interactive. You just want to, hey, I want to create those images, have them laid down at this location, and just do that so that it's the least expensive as possible on the GPU. You're going to be using the QuadBat class. So the requirements, all the objects must have the same state, of course, so that it doesn't have to switch to a different texture. You can only add instances of image quad or QuadBat class, which makes sense because you're adding just images. And yeah, you can only add objects. That's the idea.
Yeah. So the idea is you can't remove anything from a quad batch. I mean, you basically have to reset the whole thing. So it's not something you're going to be adding or removing things. Another benefit of it is you can add the same object multiple times to it, which can be useful. So we're going to talk a little bit now about multi-screen development, which is a problem that's, it's a problem for everybody. There's some nice things in Starling though that can help with that. So when you're, let's say, the example of developing a game for iOS, for the iPhone, and you have to worry about, let's say, like the iPhone 3G and the iPhone 4S, so the non-Retina and the Retina. So basically what you're going to do, similar to what you do in other development platforms, you're going to have an SD texture, and you're going to also have an HD texture. And then you're going to determine, based on what platform you're on, which texture you're actually going to use. Now, this can get confusing because when you're on a Retina screen, your game is going to be coded the same way, and you're actually going to code for an SD screen for those dimensions, but you need to actually scale down those HD textures. So that's where this property called content scale factor comes in that you can check in Starling. And you essentially get it by starling.content scale factor. And then when you're actually creating your textures, you can see that last parameter that I can pass in is that scale value. And that will handle all of it for you. So you don't have to change all of the stuff in your game to different dimensions. You can keep those same dimensions, let's say 320 by 480, and this will automatically handle the texture scaling for you.
And content scale factor is automatically computed by Starling, so you can just rely on that and pass that and get the proper scaling. It's super convenient.
It's very convenient.
So if you want to learn more about some extensions, as Lee said, the community around Starling is really growing. If you look at the forums, like tons of discussions, and people have created amazing extensions. If you want to get the list of the extensions, you can check the wiki, and I think you're going to go over the list of the extensions.
So one of the first extensions, which is really nice, is a particle system, and this uses a format that was created for this tool called Particle Designer. So this is actually a visual tool to allow you to create particle effects. And what it essentially generates is this XML file describing everything about your particle system. And then you just include that XML file into Starling, and then boom, you have your particle effects. So you don't have to know anything about particle physics and all that stuff. You can just use a visual tool to create your particle effects. Now, this is a Mac-only tool, but there's also a browser-based one, which you can get on the wiki, which allows you to create these particle effects directly in the browser as well.
Foxhole is a very interesting project. What happened is that we told people, now you need to use Stage 3. They said, okay, cool. So you give us Starling. It's a gaming framework. Great. But hey, when I create a game, I still need to have UI. I still need to have my settings for the volume. I need to have some options if I want to have a list. And for that, I don't want to code that myself. So hey, Adobe or the Starling guys, do you have a solution for that? And Josh
Tinjala.
Yeah, a great developer created that extension on top of Starling, which replicates those components, but in a very lightweight way, in the same spirit of Starling. And we're really interested at this extension because it really solves the problem that, hey, I also want to do UI components in Stage 3D.
Yeah, and this, if you check it out, the demos of this, it's actually pretty full featured. Like there's theming support, different things for scale 9 for containers. So it's actually a really nice framework. If you're looking for UI, particularly for mobile, it's really nice.
That'd be really cool to have those components supported in Flash Pro.
Wow, we won't go there.
Yeah.
So Starling itself is obviously a framework, but it's not, I would say, it's not a complete game framework in the sense that there's no built-in support for building a platformer game or something like that. So there are additional frameworks out there that are making use of Starling. One of the nicest is called the Citrus engine. What is it? Citrus?
Known as Citrus.
Citrus. That's the way he pronounces citrus, believe it or not. So this is actually, it's actually more than a platformer game engine, but this uses Starling, and it allows you to really quickly be able to build platformer games and other type of physics-based games. So all of this uses Box 2D in conjunction with Starling, and it's very simple to build these types of games. Another one, I'm sure a lot of people out here are familiar with Flashpunk, one of the best Flash game engines that's been around for a long time. Well, this is a Starling version of Flashpunk called Starling Punk, and again, it's very, very close to the original Flashpunk API, but it uses Starling behind the scenes to get that nice GPU rendering. So another thing, so we mentioned how like Adobe is actually officially supporting Starling, so we're helping to fund the project and things like that. Well, we just announced that we're also doing the same thing for Way 3D.
Yeah, and this is the same idea. We wanted to contribute to Starling and make sure the solution looks great and integrated. Now we're doing the same thing with the Way 3D so that you guys have a framework you can rely on because it's supported by Adobe. And one of the first things we did is to integrate Starling and the Way 3D so that, as a full solution, it just makes sense to have the two work together because people have asked, oh, that's really great, but now if I have a 3D game, can I also have 2D elements on top of it? And I'd like to use Starling. Yep. So this is what we've been doing.
So what they mentioned in the last session is now that Way 3D 4 is actually fully or Gold Master. And included in that is built-in support for integrating Starling with it. And I want to show you a demo of that. So here in this demo, we essentially have 3 different planes. In the background, that checkered background is actually is running in Starling, so it's animating in Starling. On the middle layer, we have an Away 3D scene. Your typical, you have your little hover camera here. And then on top of that, we actually have a Starling particle effect. So this is actually 3 different levels or 3 different layers of Stage 3D all being combined together. Starling in the background, Away 3D in the middle, and Starling again on the front. So this is really important because the feedback we heard, and here's just changing the swapping order of the levels. One of the things we heard was, okay, Way 3D is great, I'm building this 3D game, but I need a 2D menu system on top of that. I need I don't want to put the high score or all the interface elements. I don't want to do that in 3D and have to have this, So being able to now put these 2 technologies together is actually pretty cool.
It is really cool. And it's just the beginning of the integration. We're going to do more of that. But
it's going to get crazy. That's what you were talking about, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So I want to now just show a couple of demos on mobile. But before I do that, so we just did this session, Starling is great. But is anybody actually using it out there? Well, yes, they are. So the demo you've probably seen before, but I will have to show it again, is Angry Birds on Facebook. This is their Flash-based version of the game. This was built using Starling, and actually the engineers over there actually really helped with giving work back to the Starling project.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's amazing to see this game has around last time we checked around 20 million daily users. Yeah. And using Flash 11, Stage 3D, and really the lead developer when he got in charge and his manager told him you're going to do the Flash version on Facebook with Stage 3D. He kind of freaked out, saying, well, but I'm not a GPU developer. And then he started using Starling. It was a game changer for him, and he contributed lots of ideas and optimization to Starling. So that was a great effort. And that's now the example. So Rovio is using it, but now Zynga actually recently shipped Ruby Blast, this pretty cool game, and it's all Starling powered too. So you see that there's also big companies, not only indie developers behind it. And what's great is that Zynga has also contributed optimizations back to Starling. So that's really cool.
Yeah. So I mean, if you're looking for validation, again, Rovio and Zynga are choosing this for their game. So it's definitely a framework for creating professional games for sure.
One thing also is we're going to be introducing a new Stage 3D profile in 11.4. An Air 3.4, which that's going to be mainly useful for desktop. It will allow you to run GPU accelerated on more computers, more hardware, more GPU cards. And again, the beauty of the integration with Starling and Adobe is that Starling is already constraint mode ready. So if you download today's Starling, when 11.4 is going to be available, automatically Starling leverages that behind the scenes. You don't even have to worry. You'll get that feature and that improvement for free.
Yeah. So we can take some questions right now while I'm showing this. Now we're talking about Starling here, but feel free to ask us about anything Adobe gaming related. If you have questions that are not, you don't care about Starling, that's fine.
Okay.
I have.
Are we good? You want me to?
Yeah, I don't know. Okay. So I have one, high spending alert on mint.com. That's not good.
So I had a question about the content scale factor. So obviously when you're working with devices from a single vendor, there's a clear distinction, 1 times, 2 times, but how are you handling it for Android and other devices where there's a giant, broad, how do you decide, is it 1.66 or do you treat it as 1.5 or where do you decide that threshold?
Well,
if you look on the wiki for Starling, there's a few. You have a few options. I don't know why this keeps going.
So on the wiki of Starling, there's actually a table that lists all the different resolution and giving you estimations of what you can use. But to be honest with you, yes, it's easier on iOS right now, and really also Daniel comes from iOS development, so he's been doing this more like from an iOS perspective. But now, if you look at the wiki, there's also a section about that on Android. But yes, you have to figure it out yourself for Android.
And with the new ATF format and other things you're doing, is Adobe? Would you say that Adobe is headed in a direction of continuing to create tools that are more framework agnostic? Because something like ATF is something that could be useful for all kinds of different types of development.
Yeah.
Almost more of like a Photoshop approach versus the Flash,
yeah, that's a good
closed
point.
garden type perspective.
I mean, ATF has really been designed for Stage 3D, but you're right that it could be actually used by other technologies because we're going to document the spec, and it's really easy. It's basically a container containing those compressed textures. We also have tools that allow you to see what's in there. Also thinking about a Photoshop plugin. But you're right.
But it's not specific to Adobe is officially supporting Starling, and we're officially supporting Away 3D. But these things will be useful because there's a bunch of other frameworks out there that are really nice as well that will also be able to take advantage of this.
Yeah.
But just to get back to the thing on the mobile, if you look on the wiki, there's a series of recommended approaches that you could take for the whole Android thing. Like you could letterbox your game which is not always the best solution. But if you look on that wiki page, there's a wiki page on multi-screen development, and it walks through all of the various options you have to enable you to build that.
So there's a property where you could set which style it's going to use, or would that be like using capabilities, screen DPI, and kind of figuring it out yourself?
Yeah, that's what people do right now.
Okay,
Yeah.
Makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, there's a way to do that, like to distinguish an iPad 1, 2, 3, basically based out of the mixing screen DPI plus.
When you get to Android, it becomes as everybody knows, it becomes challenging.
Yeah, exactly. I was just curious because I thought about the same thing in NME, and I didn't implement a single scale factor because I thought, once you get outside of iOS, there's no clean way to do it. And for one person, they care about the 1.66, and the next person, they don't care about that at all, and they want to scale their content differently.
Yeah, I mean, the scaling only works when when it's the same resolution but scaled up. But the best solution is to dynamically lay out your elements based on which is a lot more work. But,
yeah, thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions about Starling or?
Yeah, hi guys. Sorry if this is a goofy question, but I'm not a big tech head. It's also about scaling, but more scaling within the game. And you were mentioning bitmap fonts. Like if I look at that game up there, Ruby Blast, I can count 5 different fonts at a bunch of different point sizes. So we really like to develop fluidly, and if it's it's not working at this size, crank it down. If we're working with bitmap fonts, that's adding a lot of time to that process. We also have a bunch of animated characters. We do graphic adventure games, so they have to sort of scale down as they recede in the background. I'm just worried. We don't use bitmaps yet. We're still using vectors because they scale up and down beautifully. We don't have to worry about it. But what kind of trouble are we going to run into? Like, what does the scaling look like? Is it crappy?
Well,
or
for the bitmap fonts, it's not. I mean, generally, you're bringing in the bitmap font at like a pretty large size. Like, so you can easily dial down. Like the text field has a font size property, and it will look really nice. But you only bring it in at one size, and then it will nicely shrink it down.
I mean, yeah,
like the big size, right?
Yeah, so
yeah, exactly.
You would bring it to big size and scale it down, but to make the scaling down look better, the rendering, you'll use bitmaps. And for that, you have to basically generate the bitmaps level, the different bitmaps yourself. But if you use ATF, that's the beauty of ATF. When you're going to take your image, your texture representing all the glyphs, all the fonts.
Doesn't Starling bitmap automatically?
Starling does it automatically at runtime, which may add some processing. But if you use ATF, the tool, the standalone tool will generate all the bitmaps for you inside the ATF. And Starling will leverage that. But if you generate the bitmaps, and if you use Starling, it's going to help, and it's going to make basically the rendering of those objects scaled down look really nice. If you don't do that, it's going to look really like crap.
But the key is this scaling up and down, like any bitmap thing, it works really well in Starling. It looks really nice as long as you don't go above what the original texture is. So. But that brings up a good point, because we visit a lot of game companies that are like, yeah, you keep telling us about Stage 3D, but we use Flash Pro, we like vectors, we like all this stuff.
Yeah.
And this is where it comes the difference of a GPU game is different than a game that's not on the GPU. So you are going to lose some of the niceties of vectors going to a GPU-based game. And that's why don't think you have to go to Stage 3D. Like a lot of games are fine without Stage 3D, but once you go to the GPU, then you're in a kind of another world where you have to think about it. Like you lose all that cool, just Flash just makes it look right kind of thing.
But to be honest, we understand it's a problem. It's a limitation. We have game developers telling us it's great. We want to use Stage 3D. What you're doing with Starling is great, but we're losing some flexibility. Like we're losing the power of using vector. Is amazing, and you guys have this unique strength. Use it, and so we're looking at ways to leverage that from the tool, like to make the integration with Starling tighter with Flash Pro, or let's say we could have like a Flash Pro generate an abstracted representation of vector that Starling could digest and reuse, or should we have the runtime, Swift to sprite sheet generation automatic, things like that. To give you an idea, because we're also looking at doing runtime hardware compression, so that will just provide the ping, and the runtime will automatically, by itself, encode that to hardware compressed texture, which would be the best workflow. That way you get the best of both worlds. You draw the dynamic Swift, you scale to the proper resolution, and then you just pass the bitmap data you generated, and it gets uploaded to the GPU and compressed and decompressed on the GPU, and then so that you can dispose that, and it's no longer in CPU memory. And we're going there, but the whole vector thing is an authoring problem, and we should fix it.
Okay, and why Swift and not Swick?
Well, because if you can't load a Swick at runtime, you need to take a Swift and extract the classes, and then instantiate the objects and then draw them. A Swick is already precompiled, so you wouldn't use that.
Thanks.
Hi, yeah, I've been following your blogs for a while, so I have to say kudos. You've been there for me for a while, so that's awesome. I love stuff I learned from you guys.
Thanks.
But yeah, so my question is, there's a known practice in Flash that a lot of animators and game designers go for, creating basically skeletons, right? So you can go just change the arms to whatever graphic you want, or those kind of design solutions like zombies or robots, or all those cool stuff. Yep. So the question is there like support for that in Starling, or there's a plan to make something like that so you can go design skeletons?
Yeah, so that's a really good question, and it's something that, because a lot of times when we go to game developers, they're like, sprite sheets are not going to work for us, because like let's say I have a character of a guy who's like running. Okay, I could put that into a sprite sheet, that would work. But what if like you could buy new clothes to customize the character?
Exactly.
Like I can't have every possible, the sprite sheets would be too big. There's a great tool, which is it's a Kickstarter project, right, called Spriter. I don't know if you've seen that. And it's a different way of doing animation. So basically, you bring in all your body parts and you animate things like on a timeline, like in Flash. But what it exports is essentially a data file containing all of the animation. So all you would upload, put in the sprite sheet is just the body parts. And then you have this data file which essentially animates all those parts. So that is definitely something we are. Well, I believe Spriter actually already has it. It's already able to export to Starling.
Yeah, there's already a Starling support.
So that approach is definitely something we're going to look at for Flash Pro.
Yeah.
Whereas a sprite sheet is great, but in a lot of games you can't use sprite sheets because of that reason, like customization.
We totally. I mean, we've been talking about that internally because that's been a limitation, and people moving from the display list, which is very flexible. You can have complex nested objects, and they tell us, hey, sprite sheets, welcome to the 80s, guys. I mean,
Yeah, I mean that's.
So we know that it's we need to fix that. So we're looking at that, and you should see some stuff soon on that.
But definitely, check out Spriter for an
Spriter
example.
first.
Yeah, check it out for an example of that style of thing, and it really works well. So I would love to see that in Flash Pro, be able to have something you animate, but it exports this data file, which just so I think that's definitely something.
Yep.
All right, on the backlog. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. Question over here.
Question over there.
Come on, Colin.
This will be the last one, guys.
Okay. Well, we can answer questions after that. I mean, offline.
I noticed that you mentioned having to emit vectors in order to achieve GPU acceleration. Regarding vector-based hardware-accelerated flash engines such as Autodesk Scaleform, have you tested the two side by side?
Yeah. So so Scaleform and which one? The one we have random mode GPU, or which other?
Well, the impression that I got from what you said was that vectors are antithetical to accelerating on the GPU, but that seems to be one of the key visual benefits of using Scaleform.
Yeah, so Scaleform, that's essentially, it's an authoring thing. Scaleform does that, and it basically, or actually they also have a runtime version of it. Yeah, well, we had something similar to Scaleform. Essentially, you would use random mode GPU, and to be honest, we're moving away from that for the reason that there's no silver bullet. It actually works pretty nicely if you author your content with that in mind, but we had lots of issues with that model. Why? Because people have with the displays that we have right now, which is redesigned for the CPU, people have different expectations. They tend to do lots of things that they expect to work. And then when we try to GPU accelerate that, we can't handle all the cases, all the scenarios, and people are actually saying, performance is not great, it's not optimized, you're breaking this, or it's not what I expected. If I touch this, then it has this impact. It's all implicit. I don't know what's happening. So we're kind of exposing something more low level. And this approach, the fact that you can use vector and leverage GPU acceleration, we want to solve that through tools, Flash Pro or other tools. So to summarize it, Scaleform, it's a very interesting technology. We have something similar, but we want to basically take a different route and offer the flexibility of Stage 3D and solve that issue through tooling, rather than having this automatic technology like implicit behavior.
Okay, thank you.
Can you take one more right there?
One more quick one.
All right, cool. Thanks, Colin. You're the man.
Where's that?
Yep.
Thank you. This isn't a Starling question, but what options are available for developers who want to integrate in-app purchases or like Game Center support, like for their mobile apps?
Yep. So we have something called native extensions for Air for mobile, which allows you to basically, like, if the Air runtime doesn't give you support for, let's say, Game Center or OS specific stuff, you can create a native extension which extends Air. But the reality is that there are people already creating all of these extensions which you can use. For instance, there's a free open source Game Center extension. And there's a bunch created by Milkman Games out of San Francisco that are really cheap for in-app purchases, like everything you would want to do. So, but that's the model. Is we're instead of us having to wait for us to include it in the core air runtime, to use this native extension feature to do it. So almost all the game-related things you would want to do on specific platforms is already a native extension for.
Yep.
So there's a pretty good ecosystem surrounding that stuff.
Thank you very much.
Yep. All right, well, thanks. We'll be around the rest of the day. Well, I think we're going to go out and get something to eat because apparently we missed lunch. It smelled good, though.